coming. This is kind of one of the exciting colloquia for us because our colleagues are talking. Welcome back. For those of you who are new, this is always kind of an important, over the years, we've probably been doing this since about 2015. We have a monthly colloquium on research topic. We try to cover a wide range of fields. You know, every semester we'll have a physical geographer, kind of more geospatial oriented talk, and a human geographer. So thank you so much for coming. We're just getting started again. This is really intended to be sort of a community building time for us to kind of, you know, enjoy the work we do and talking to each other about it. Typically, we would bring refreshments of some kind. Of course, we can't do that now. And I also wanted to announce that following the meeting, particularly given that, we're going to head straight over to the Tivoli at the brewery. Is that correct?
Yes, it's technically called the Tivoli Tap House, but you know the Tivoli building, it's just there, and there's a nice outdoor patio. Again, you know, normally we would have some refreshments and we could chat and hang out for a bit here, but we can't do that. So we hope that you can join us by just going over to the Tivoli Tap House, the patio.
Just to clarify for people, I think you have to go into the patio. Do you, or can you enter the patio from out here? So just be aware that you may have to go in through the restaurant.
I don't think so, Amanda.
Can you? I just can't remember, so I just didn't want people to be.
You know, I used to go go to the parking lot.
Yeah,
I think.
So hopefully, yes.
Okay.
We just don't want to lose any people.
Yeah.
We'll be socializing.
Just a time to sit down and talk to everyone about the week and meet with faculty, meet with your cohort, meet with people in other program. So welcome again. Thank you so much, and I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks.
Anne.
Thank you. So my name's Ann Chen, and I have the honor of organizing the colloquia series this year. So let me introduce Dr. Kelsey as the first speaker. We're doing kind of a tag team. But the theme of, so with Dr. Kelsey and Dr. Ben Crawford, and I will join them as well. And the theme of our talks, we're sharing a little bit about our work, recent work. But the theme of our talks, our research topics today, is kind of tackling challenges of a rapidly changing environment. I know that as geographers and environmental scientists, we care about that. We probably recognize that, and that Earth and Earth's surface and the atmosphere has been changing at unprecedented rates recently, and we're studying to understand it, and even as a society, we have to prepare and anticipate, mitigate, and adapt to it. So that's kind of what we're about, what we're talking about. That's the theme that underlies our talk. So brief comments today. So Dr. Kelsey is going to talk about how climate will alter vegetation in the growing season. Right? Please welcome Dr. Kelsey.
Great, thanks so much, Dr. Chen. And I have a very brief preview for you all of where we're headed with this. How is climate change going to alter the growing season in the Arctic, and especially in Arctic Alaska? It matters, winter is not coming. We're not quite the same. So that's what the topic of this work is. There's a number of colleagues who have contributed to this work that I wanted to acknowledge here, and it was funded by the National Science Foundation. Climate change is increasing the length of the growing season, and this is happening globally. This map here is showing how many days the growing season has actually increased, so from the start of spring to the end of fall, how that growing season has actually increased over this period of about 60 years. You can see over almost all of the globe, the growing season is getting longer. And this has some important implications for vegetation, for how big plants grow, for where plants grow, what kind of vegetation communities we see, and also for global carbon cycling. I just realized I want to ditch that. And also for global carbon cycling, how plants are taking up carbon and returning it to the atmosphere in different places. We particularly are interested in these processes in the Arctic because the Arctic plays a really important role in global carbon cycles. The other important thing about the Arctic is that snow is present on the ground for most of the year. And so understanding the dynamics of plants, plant phenology, which is the word we use to describe when things start growing in the spring, when leaves fall off of the shrubs in the fall, plant phenology, and also the productivity, how much plants grow. In order to understand these processes, and especially how they're changing, we need to understand how they relate to snow in this environment where snow is present on the ground for 3/4 of the year. So the questions of this particular work that I'm presenting to you today are first, how do plant phenology and productivity, so timing and growth, how do they vary among the different types of vegetation that we see in the Arctic? And what is the role of snow and temperature, especially with temperature in the winter and the spring, in controlling these processes? So for this work, I used a combination of data sets to get at these questions. First, I used daily, remotely sensed vegetation greenness data, this metric many are probably familiar with called NDVI, the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. And I had data available on a daily time scale at a 500-meter spatial resolution for a period of 17 years. This is the data that allowed me to look at phenology and productivity. We also had modeled snow data. So these data come from a model, it's called Snow Model, that uses very detailed meteorological data and topography to give us a spatially explicit, data where we can look at any location across our study region and estimate how much snow is present at the same exact temporal and spatial scale. So we can produce this data daily at the exact same spatial scale as our vegetation data. And then finally, I used a vegetation land cover map where we have mapped out where these different Arctic vegetation communities exist to look at how the relationship between vegetation and snow may look different in different vegetation types. The 6 vegetation types looked at are pictured here. So these are several that contain more grass-like species. So that's wet sedge, Carex aquatilis, and both of the tussock tundra. And then some environments that have more shrubby species. These dwarf shrubs that you can see in the pictures, that's as tall as vegetation gets in the Arctic. By definition, Arctic environments are above tree line, and so your tallest vegetation is about knee height. So this pretty much spans all the types of vegetation that we see. So within each vegetation type, we identified locations where we had relatively homogeneous vegetation over the whole area of our 500-meter remotely sensed pixel. So we're looking for homogeneous vegetation, and that helped us identify points to focus these analyses. Ultimately, we identified 100 points in each of these 6 vegetation types that we could track carefully for this analysis. And this map shows the distribution of these points across northern Alaska. So I mentioned that this NDVI variable, this measure of greenness, was the metric used to identify plant phenology, start and end of season, peak of season. This is exactly how it worked. We used the curve of these values over the course of a year to establish where the start of the season was, a date for that, the date of the peak of the season, the date the season ended, And then we could look at the area under that curve to give us a metric of total productivity. So a longer growing season or one where we had a lot of productivity at peaks can give a larger number. And that one's called the time integrated NDVI. That's the metric of productivity. Similarly, we had to produce these metrics for snow. So for snow, at each of our 600 locations, at each of those points we identified, we again had a couple metrics we were picking out. And these are determined by the ways that snow affects plants, the important things that snow does that affects the timing and amount of plant growth. One is this snow water equivalent. So one of the things that snow does for plants is provide water. It's this nice reservoir of water that is released to them in the spring, just as things are kind of warming up and getting going. The snow water equivalent, which is often abbreviated as SWE, it gives us a measure of exactly how much water there is in the snowpack. Another thing that snow does for plants is it forms this nice insulating blanket that protects plants from really cold winter temperatures in the deep of winter. So actually the presence of snow keeps the plants and the soil a little warmer. And that's critical because if the snow is present keeping soils warmer, there's actually the potential for some microbial activity to continue through the winter. And so we used a metric of the actual insulating capacity of the snow to produce this active days. How many days do we estimate that there could be activity within the soil, microbial activity within the soil? The day that snow is removed from the landscape, the day that all the snow is gone, another critical time in the life of plants, they have access to sunlight again, temperatures really start warming up at that time, so we tracked the snow-free date. And then finally, this last metric is a measure of accumulated heat available to plants through the growing season. This is something that's been shown to be really important predictor of the timing of plant growth, is this growing degree days. So once the snow is gone from the landscape, when the snow is present, all the energy is going into melting snow. When the snow's gone, then there's actual energy going into warming soil, and that can start contributing to plant growth. So these are the 4 metrics that we use to look at snow. So we use these snow model outputs, these metrics I just talked about with you, active days, snow-free date, that snow water equivalent, and growing degree days, as the predictor variables, and then the vegetation, phenology and productivity. Phenology, the timing, start of season, peak of season, end of season, and then overall productivity as our response variables. We used a modeling approach to look at the nature of the relationship between these snow variables and these vegetation outputs. And again, we were looking to identify what are the most important controls, which of these temperature and snow attributes is the most important for vegetation, and what does that relationship look like. And by describing what that relationship looks like, then we start to have the ability to say, well, what might happen to these different vegetation communities in the future, given that we anticipate snow conditions and temperature conditions will change. So how do these phenology and productivity metrics vary? The timing, the phenology, the timing of growth varies only about 10 days across all of these vegetation types. So once the spring hits in the Arctic, things are just happening really fast. We are seeing not a whole lot of variability in the timing of when these processes take place. We did see differences in this amount of productivity. So our vegetation types that exist primarily further south, and intuitively the ones with the taller shrub growth as opposed to just the grass lakes, had higher productivity. And which of these winter conditions are most important? So this graphic here is showing the importance of a given predictor, the importance of one of those snow or temperature variables is indicated by the size of the dot we're looking at here. And we're looking at this for the different snow vegetation predictors, and then the relationship with the phenology and productivity responses. So for productivity, for how much the plants grow, this active days, the actual insulating capacity of the snow was important was the most important in about half of these vegetation types. So our strongest kind of predictor of productivity was these active days. For the timing, for the phenology, especially for the start and the end of the season, it was really that temperature, that accumulated temperature, growing degree days, that was most important. So the final question here is, well, so those are the most important predictors, but what actually does the relationship look like? And so these plots here, for each individual vegetation type, are showing us the nature of that relationship. And for start of season and end of season, what we see is that this growing season starts and ends earlier in warmer years, which is interesting because it's not completely consistent with these global trends we're seeing. We're seeing that warmer conditions may actually just shift our growing season here rather than expanding it. There are other studies also showing this for the Arctic. And then what about productivity? How do those winter conditions contribute to productivity? So productivity is responsive to the insulating effect of the snow in 3 of our vegetation types, in a manner that the greater insulating capacity, the nice, fluffy, deep snow, is actually contributing to greater productivity. And conversely, less insulating capacity would be less productivity. And in our other vegetation types, the productivity is again responding to the accumulated heat. So I want to pull this together in some conclusions for you. Overall, these temperature conditions in the winter and spring and snow properties are really important in determining these vegetation responses. And we anticipate they will be to determining vegetation conditions in future climate. And I'll map out what this might look like. One future climate condition that we anticipate in the Arctic is actually more precipitation and greater snow accumulation. And that's because warmer temperatures actually allow the air to hold more moisture. And so we expect there might actually be more snow falling and more precipitation falling in these regions. So that could mean a couple things. If the snow properties of that snowpack are very insulating, it's nice, fluffy, dry snow, that would probably mean more active days. That would give us more insulation. But more precipitation could mean that we have snow that's maybe intermixed with some midwinter rain events that's starting to happen in some regions. And so more precipitation in that case might actually mean that we have a less insulating snowpack and we have fewer active days. And the results of our analyses here show this is really going to matter in terms of how plants respond. More active days means we probably see greater productivity, and that'd probably be across most of these vegetation types. Fewer active days, we might actually see a really mixed response among different vegetation types that's harder to predict. Another thing we strongly anticipate seeing with future climate is warmer temperatures. Warmer temperatures in winter and through the growing season. Our results show that warmer temperatures might actually serve to shift the growing season in this region. Starts a little earlier, but also ends a little earlier. But of course, those warmer temperatures, if they're contributing to changing the properties of the snowpack, again, are going to alter the productivity responses. So this maps out for us how understanding the relationship between temperature and snow and plants is really going to be important in understanding how this area responds to climate, and then how those plant and vegetation changes might feed back into larger global processes. So we'll do a couple questions between presentations, and then we can do some at the end as well.
Can you go back to the graph by vegetation type? associated with the active growing days? You had several. Right, so it looks like some of those dip as the active growing days increase, like the AD there.
Yeah.
Is that because of the insulation effect that they're like, I don't know, losing it? Or how would you explain that, I guess?
So right like this?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And the reason why the trends are, so I don't, the reason why the trends I think are a little messy is that we're seeing gradients and things like active days that are playing out along a couple different types of gradients. So some of those could be interannual variability, because this is 17 years over a large spatial area. So some of that's probably interannual variability in a warmer year or a cooler year, or a big snow year and a lesser snow year. But there's also gradients across latitude, and so there are a couple of things going on.
So some kind of selection bias going on, basically.
Gregory?
Okay, there's someone else in there. Okay, two questions. You can answer one, two, or neither of them. One is, okay, so the last slide where you had the kind of linking up the snow cover to the vegetation productivity, and you, at the very end you said the kind of implications in terms of the feedback. I'm imagining that the scenario where there's more vegetation, I'm thinking at a global system scale, the more vegetation, the more productive days there are, the more photosynthesis it does, the more carbon dioxide is. So I'm just wondering if, like, you can speak at all, or is your research thinking at all about that? The bigger considerations of productivity days in terms of carbon dioxide absorption by the vegetation and how that might feed back into the global system of climate change?
Yeah, and that's a great question, because that's one of the real interests among a lot of folks who study Arctic environments, as this is one of the areas we have the potential to actually potentially see a negative feedback on climate change, which we kind of rarely hear about those. But there is the potential that this area, this region, could become warmer. Warmer would both mean warmer in the summer, that could promote more growth, warmer in spring and summer. But also, if there were more snow, a nice insulating snowpack, allow for more microbial activity over winter that really primes the soil for a lot of growth in the summer. And that's one of the motivating questions kind of behind a lot of this work. And it's interesting because there are some studies coming out that are showing a longer growing season, and they're kind of showing maybe the potential for that negative feedback. And there's also a lot of work coming out that's showing that in the Arctic we seem to be shifting the growing season a little earlier, and it's thought maybe there's actually a water limitation appearing at the end of the summer. So even though there's still warm temperatures, potentially the season could extend. Plants are hitting a water limitation that's kind of cutting off the growing season early.
Yeah, I was just going to say also, you don't have to answer this, but I'm curious how this study would be conducted in a place like Denver, where it snows and it like clears out, and it snows again, and it clears out through spring. And so I imagine this is sort of like a really great model, kind of conditions to do this research, because like once the snow's gone, I presume it's gone permanently for the year.
Right, yeah.
I don't know, I'm just curious like how this would be done in a place like Denver.
Well, sneak preview, Ben and I are starting to try to look at some of these start of season, end of season patterns and trends through the Denver area, so stay tuned. And maybe with that, I don't know, yeah.
A song of fire and ice. So I'm not going to be singing or anything, but we are going to be talking about a whole range of conditions, really covering from the Arctic down to the tropics in this colloquium here. So today I'm going to talk a little bit more about an idea conceptually, rather than go into too much detail on some specific research. But generally we're talking about low-cost sensors and how we can use these to monitor different types of air quality events, in particular extreme events. So first, a little bit of context, big picture. Poor air quality is a really big global health issue. Okay? So for many, many people around the world, breathing is probably the most dangerous thing they do all day. And here in the US, fine particulate matter, so PM, that's going to come up a lot, PM, is responsible for 85,000 to 200,000 excess deaths each year. So that's a lot of people who are affected by that. just in this country. Worldwide, the number is even bigger, talking millions and millions of premature deaths from poor air quality. So even though it's a really widespread issue, global air quality networks actually measuring and monitoring conditions on the ground are relatively sparse. So we can see from this map collects open source air quality data from all around the world. We can see that these stations are not distributed evenly everywhere. We've got a lot of coverage in North America and Europe and parts of Asia, but there's huge gaps on this map. If we zoom in a little bit, we can see that these existing networks, furthermore, are really oriented towards cities, towards urban areas. So this is the official monitoring network in Colorado. You can see most of the stations here are in the Front Range. And this really makes sense. This is a good setup. Okay? This is where most of the people live. This is where most of the air pollution sources are. I'm thinking about things like industry and traffic. And this is also where, historically, there's been the worst air quality out of these chronically poor ambient air quality situations. But, however, this approach isn't really designed for other kinds of air quality events. I'm thinking in particular of short-lived, really intense, severe air quality events. For us here, the big thing that comes to mind, obviously, is wildfires. So if you imagine that situation, we have a few weeks, maybe a few days of really intense, poor air quality, and it's affecting places that normally have clean air that don't necessarily have monitors. Okay, so this is affecting rural areas that normally have clean air. So what I'm saying is, what I'm arguing is we really need new approaches to study these new kind of extreme air quality events. We need things that are flexible, things that we can distribute rapidly and put out in different configurations, things that can go in remote areas with independent power supplies, data communications, things like that. So let's examine this a little bit more. Here's a scale figure. Good geographers, we like to think about scale a lot. So here on the x-axis is a time scale, and on the y-axis is a space scale. Okay? So on the largest scale here, we've got long-lived, globally well-mixed air pollutants, things like CFCs, things like greenhouse gases. And we're actually pretty good at measuring things at this big scale. Okay? We have satellites that can do really good at broad spatial coverage, although they don't have that really fine scale resolution that we like. We have some fixed global networks that can measure everywhere these well-mixed conditions, these well-mixed pollutants. So we're pretty good at this scale. If we drop down into this middle scale, we're pretty good here as well. This is what our regulatory networks that I showed you from Colorado, this is what they're really good at measuring. Okay, they're really set up to measure these ambient conditions on kind of landscape scales across fairly large regions. Where I think we're lacking is down here at the smaller end of the scale. Okay, so exposures that are happening from hours up to a few days, up to a few weeks, and along a whole continuum of spatial scales, really. Definitely micro scales if you think of an individual plume maybe coming from a factory that's wafting through a neighborhood, all the way up to big smoke plumes from wildfires that are affecting entire regions. I think we're lacking in this area of measurements. So, our low-cost sensor is a solution. Okay? Can it help fill this gap? So what I mean by low-cost sensors, if we imagine this spectrum of different kinds of monitoring technology, here at the most expensive end is a whole regulatory station. You maybe have seen them on the side of the road. They're literally a whole trailer full of computers and pumps and sensors, and they can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. An individual sensor of this kind of caliber is tens of thousands of dollars. So that's why there's only a handful of stations around, is because they're so expensive. So what I'm talking about are sensors in this range, hundreds of dollars up to a couple thousands of dollars. Okay? So this is relatively low cost. And so the advantage of these are fairly obvious. We can put a lot of them out there for the same cost as one of these big stations. So if we put a lot of them out there, we can make these dense networks. We can move things around as needed if we need to. And they can also continuously monitor. We can get short-term spikes and calculate these longer-term averages. And then it's a way, potentially, to get data and sensors into the hands of people, into the hands of communities, a way to democratize data. This approach does have some challenges, of course. Okay? The sensor accuracy and calibration, sometimes it's just unknown. We just don't know how well these sensors are doing. Other times, we really need to do some work calibrating them in order for them to be useful. Maintenance and troubleshooting, a lot of sensors, a lot of problems, always out there fixing. And then often data interpretation and communication can be an issue as well. And right now we're still limited in the number and kind of pollutants we can actually measure. So, but I think there's a lot of promise with this approach. And so here's an example from Hawaii about with some work that I have been doing. So in 2018, in the summer of 2018, Kilauea volcano on the Big Island experienced its largest eruption in over 200 years. It came on quite suddenly. All of a sudden, rifts were opening up in these populated areas. Lava was gushing out. It was pretty wild. This is a picture of the lava river that's flowing through this residential agriculture area. You can see this side is really green, and this side has been chemically singed, chemically burned. So the winds this whole time were blowing from left to right. Okay, so we had really steady winds during this whole time, and we can see the effect of these emissions from the lava. So over 50,000 tons of sulfur dioxide gas, which is not good to breathe, was being emitted per day in a populated area. And so within days, we were able to set up an emergency network of these kinds of sensors. We were already on the ground there. We had already done some work there, so we weren't starting from scratch. But we were the first people to really be there and put up sensors around the community that helped schools decide whether they should stay open or closed, for example. So within a few days, we were able to set up that network. Within a few weeks, we were able to set up an even larger network of about 20 sensors all around the island. So during this eruption, the lava affected pretty severely affected an area very close to the eruption, whereas the air quality impacts were much more widespread. So with this network of sensors, we wanted to be able to track the chemical transformation of these pollutants, of this plume, and also measure how much of this air pollution people were breathing. We wanted to get an estimate for exposure. So we were able to do that. We got a snapshot of a few weeks during the eruption. So this is some results in a paper that just came out this summer. We could see on these maps, here's our sensors, sensor maps. The orange is sulfur dioxide. So the winds are blowing from the northeast, moving down this way. So downwind of these triangles where the eruption was happening, we had high sulfur dioxide gas. We had high SO2. Downwind, on the downwind side of the coast, we had high particulate matter concentrations. So that gas had chemically transformed into particulate matter. And we were able to track that transformation and calculate the chemical rate of change, which was pretty cool. We were also able to estimate some high-resolution population exposures. So we knew how many people were living around each one of our sensors. So we could calculate a population-weighted exposure for each of these sensors and for our entire network as well. So this is really cool, something that wasn't possible before with these existing measurements that were there, of only a few stations. Cool. So what about wildfire smoke? Right? So this is what's affecting us here locally in Denver a lot. It's a different situation than Hawaii. Okay? Wildfires are very dynamic. Okay? They're moving, constantly changing, growing, shrinking in a different way than our eruption was. The terrain, the meteorology, and the chemistry is also much more complex and variable. So I would say it's a step up in terms of complexity and difficulty. But the same idea should apply. We should be able to have a flexible network of sensors that we can deploy. And this is something that's really important because we're starting to see this emerging smoke season here in Denver. Okay, so this is looking at air quality data for the past 4 years. This is how far back I can pull from this database. But you can see this at June, July, August, September, and even into October of last year, this emerging smoke season. Okay, so it's really something that's changing rapidly, and we'll have to keep an eye on this. So this is from our regulatory network, but low-cost sensors and networks are being used already for smoke. So I think being driven by this really smoky conditions we've had the past few years, there's been this tremendous surge in people buying their own home air quality sensor units. So you can buy them online for a couple $100, $250 or so. The company is called Purple Air. Okay? They measure particulate matter. Okay? So they measure PM only. You plug them into your house, you connect it to the Wi-Fi, and your data is uploaded, and you can see it on a map. It's pretty cool. And other agencies now and other companies are starting to take this data and use it. Okay? So here's our low-cost sensor map of Colorado. Okay? The square symbols are the low-cost sensors. The round ones are the regulatory stations. So you can see there's dozens and dozens of more measurements out there right now. So this is really good. This is giving us a good idea of what's happening in some of these places that didn't have measurements before. And it's something that's really complementary to things like satellite and the regulatory networks. So as I mentioned, it's starting to be used, it's starting to get picked up in these official forecasts and models and smoke products. But how well do we actually understand this data that's out there that's coming in? And how are these measurements calibrated? And where even are these sensors? Some are indoors, some are outdoors. I don't know, some might be just in somebody's garage. We just don't know where these are all the time. How long do they last? This is fairly new. Are they going to last years and years, or are they only good for a couple of seasons? We just don't know the answers to a lot of these questions. And we're still limited to only measuring particulate matter, which if you're only going to measure one, that's the one to measure. But there's other things at play too, other gases. And then we're still limited to areas with Wi-Fi. So that usually means we're pretty close to someone's house or indoors. So if we can expand beyond these Wi-Fi areas, that would be pretty good as well. So our next steps then, thinking about low-cost sensors and these networks that are already in place, are to further characterize these sensors in terms of how they perform, how well they do in a wide variety of different environmental conditions. And we want to also include different pollutants in these sensors and get them out into more places, into more remote communities, so we can get an estimate of exposure in some of these places. And then finally, we can think about applying these to other hazards, maybe extreme heat, for example. Okay, so finally, I'll wrap it up here by saying I'm really excited about low-cost sensors and the potential they have for science and monitoring, but they're also really great for education. They're really great in the classroom. It's pretty fun to have people get their hands on sensors and do things in the class with them. And it's also, I think, there's a lot of potential here for environmental justice, for communities getting their hands on sensors, independently monitoring their own environment and empowering them in that way. So I'll wrap it up there.
We'll take a couple of questions.
Yeah, any questions?
I have more of a standard one. On the first map, it shows that typhoons are like listed as an influencer for air quality. How is that?
Yeah, so that map, so good question. So this map is, I like this map a lot. It's showing aerosols around the Earth. And this is for one particular day in 2018. So there's a lot of sources of aerosols. Aerosols are always in the Earth, all around, or in the atmosphere all the time. So this blue color is sea salt. So this hurricane and these storms are actually generating a lot of aerosols, bringing stuff up from the ocean, and it's sea salt.
I have a question. In the chart showing the smoke season in Colorado, I noticed there was kind of another peak like in the beginning of the year. Aside from summer, do you know or have an idea what those are from?
Yeah, so this is kind of our standard seasonality that we see. We usually see higher PM in the winter and lower in the summer. Part of that is meteorology. Okay, so things are a little bit more stagnant. There's not as much heat to kind of generate these buoyant thermals that mix things up like there is in the summer. And part of that is us. It's cold, we're burning more fossil fuels to stay warm. But, so that's our typical pattern in the winter, higher levels, but now we're seeing the emergence of this secondary peak here later in the summer. Hey, wrap it up.
Okay. Sorry, I'm not wrapping
Okay.
up. I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about the impact of citizen science to these sorts of things, because to me, these two talks are so related for me at least, with studying agriculture and then the ability to have low-cost monitoring on a location. And sort of, how does taking data at that level or at the citizen science level for a person at the university, how do we trust that data? How do we move forward with like your research as far as having those low-cost monitors out there? And I was just wondering if you could speak to how you can work with that data in a reasonable way and trust it.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a big question, and I think it's something a lot of people are trying to figure out. I would start by saying there's more value in citizen science data than just its research value. I think there's value in people collecting data just for the sake of collecting data and understanding what goes into that and learning what those measurements mean. To use it in research, yeah, that can be a challenge. I think a big key is metadata for all you GIS people out there. So having the ability to know where these sensors are, how they were installed, can allow people who are doing research to decide which stations they want to use. So I'd say the more we know about them and the more people know how they might be used, I think we'll have better results for that. But yeah, that's definitely an ongoing topic in a lot of areas.
I mean, just with along the same lines, what are the major challenges, like 1, 2, 3, in terms of using these low-cost distributed systems, citizen science, to integrate it with other scales and other sensors? Would it be standardization and connectivity or what?
Yeah, that's another good question. There's a lot of challenges. There's a whole lot of technical challenges, just building them and getting them to be connected. There's a lot of data management challenges, just collecting all that data and being able to store it and have that be accessible. There's a lot of interpretive kind of challenges as well. How do we then display that data? Because just people don't want to look at a spreadsheet. People want to look at nice maps or nice graphs. So that can be a whole challenge as well. And then, integrating them with these other systems such as satellites and regulatory networks. That's a hard one because nothing is measuring the exact same thing. So they're all measuring slightly different things in slightly different ways. So there's a lot of, I don't know what the word is. It's just hard to do that sometimes. And so maybe that's another communication thing. Maybe communication and education about what these different things are doing and saying is another challenge, I suppose. Hey, Brent.
No, question really, just a comment based on what you're saying, Ben. It's really interesting because with the recent wildfires we've been having, in the neighborhood where I'm living now, I still see people going out and running and biking, and I ask them, so aren't you concerned about, the air quality? And their response to me is, well, I can still breathe, and just fine. And so I'm thinking, how do we, this is not really a question, but really I think importantly, how do we bridge the distance between a number that a sensor spits out and the perception that the air quality is okay as long as I can still breathe. And I'm interested in knowing how we take that and connect people with the data.
Yeah, that's a great question. I have no idea. I mean, there's a lot of debate that's happening in the world about other health-related things and protective measures we could take. And so I don't know how to get through to people.
Sorry, a bit more.
No, that's fine. I would also say there's no one number either that applies to everyone. Everyone's different. Everyone has a different level of sensitivity. And I would also say that we don't know exactly the health effects of some of these short-lived extreme events. They're probably not good, but we don't know how bad they are. There's a lot of data showing into describing how long-term exposure, chronic exposure over years and years can affect people's health, but there's much less on how a short couple of weeks every summer might affect us.
Thanks.
Hi everyone, thanks again for coming today on a Friday. I kept forgetting that Monday is a holiday. I guess we just sort of work and not remember these things, so we especially appreciate seeing you today. So I get to take us to the ground, to the Earth's surface, from high latitudes and vegetation to the air and monitoring systems. I am a fluviogeomorphologist, so I study river systems and Earth's superficial processes. And the focus of my brief comments today is using natural approaches to restore channels, river channels, and particularly urban channels. It's important to me. I spent decades early in my career kind of focusing on basic research questions, doing field work and laboratory analyses and so forth. I still do that. But at the same time, it is also important for me to be able to use knowledge in the real world, and this is one of the opportunities that I have to do that. So, and I'm going to share a really fun project that I've had an opportunity to participate in recently. So again, kind of back to the theme of changes on Earth's surface, rapid changes. Clearly, human activities in the last few decades have changed, we know, have changed Earth's surface everywhere and in every way. And here, just some examples that we know through agriculture, clear cutting, mining, the construction of dams that have interrupted the flow of water and sediment, that have fragmented river systems and habitats and so forth. And of course, urbanization, changing land covers. River systems, to a large extent, have felt and sort of absorbed the brunt of a lot of these human impacts because they are low-lying points on Earth's surface, and they integrate the effects of a lot of these human activities, and particularly in urban areas. And so we tend to experience what is known as the urban stream syndrome, in which, we probably know it in terms of degraded urban streams and urban areas experiencing flashy runoff and hydrographs and again, ecological degradation and all of that. Some data, in the US, there are 6 million kilometers of river channels, and it's been estimated that almost 80% of them have been impacted by human activities, and that only leaves, and another 19% affected by dams and reservoirs, so there's really hardly any river system or river channel that remains relatively unimpacted. And the EPA officially logs about 1/3 of river channels officially listed as impacted or polluted. And needless to say, there's decreasing diversity in aquatic wildlife and so on. So restoring streams is important. And the aim, of course, is to recoup some of the lost ecosystem services. And it is really a big business in the US, particularly out in the West, California, and also parts of the East like Florida and so forth. And in the last 2 decades, that it has really been a big focus in terms of fluvial systems and fluvial geomorphology, and lots of opportunities out there for students in that way, consulting and solving environmental problems. Traditionally, restoring river systems has, from a geomorphic standpoint, it is focused on the stability of the systems to sort of like engineering the system so that it maintains some kind of stability, so that it doesn't move, basically, was one of the ideas for restoring systems because of the risk to humans, to society, because, degraded river systems or eroding river systems might take our land, might take our backyard, and so forth. So again, one of the foci traditionally has been stabilizing the system so that it doesn't move. And as we have gained understanding about meanders, So these are the kinds of things that were common. This is actually near Berkeley, California, kind of a famous scene here of constructing these large meanders. More recently, as we've learned more about how river systems work, there's been an approach towards a little bit softer, environmentally friendly approaches of using more natural materials like logs and so forth, and maybe even with some ability for them to move a little bit and to create pools and habitats a little bit on their own. And that has been an approach and certainly advocated by fluvial geomorphologists and environmental scientists. For my part, my contributions in this way has primarily focused on the use of these step pool systems that characterize steeper environments where the bed forms, the characteristic bed forms, are these steps and pools. Whereby the steps, as you probably are familiar, have seen them, the steps are collections of these larger rocks, and they alternate with pools naturally to form kind of a staircase-like profile. Their main function is to dissipate stream energy in these high gradient environments. And by dissipating energy, well, that keeps the system stable by themselves naturally. So that's kind of why they are in these mountain steep areas. We didn't know very much about them as we did some other components of the river systems like meander. And so that had been early on in my career the focus of my research. And then at some point we kind of picked up on the fact that, well, you know what? They are very similar. They look very similar to these engineered drop structures. We see them all the time. I think there's one very nearby in Cherry Creek, right? They function in exactly the same way, except that we engineer them. They're there to dissipate stream energy so that to basically inhibit erosion at these places. So once we made the connection, then it just really seemed logical. What about if we use step pool systems to restore streams instead of building these things? Why don't we try to install natural step pool systems? Because we had already gained sufficient knowledge at some point so that we had an idea as to how to build them. For example, the spacing and the sizes and so on. And so that's what I've had opportunities to do in river restoration. Just to show some examples, these are all constructed step pool systems. Look at sort of this one in San Ramon, California. This is, as you can see, using logs. In Oregon, the Sayus Law National Forest, you kind of see building these systems with logs, and then there are others. Most of them have been in Northern California. This is a creek near Berkeley as well, in El Cerrito, and this is Cordonices Creek in Berkeley. The early generations of these things, however, have still been a little bit engineered in that you can almost see they're kind of anchored and wired into the stream channel so that they were still not really able to move, but they were better, I guess, than those engineered drop structures. Those early generation step pool systems used to restore rivers, they also tended to be oversized. They were just kind of really large still because of the idea of trying to reduce risk, trying to basically kind of overdoing it to make sure that we're protected and to reduce the risk and damage to property and to lives and so on. Well, most recently, we kind of felt like we could do better than that. We could, with the knowledge that we have now gained, we could do better than this. And so this is the project that I want to share that was kind of fun to do. So I had an opportunity to participate in this project of restoring a stream in Berkeley, Wildcat Creek, in which we hypothesized, okay, we know enough about these systems now. What if we did not anchor them? And we kind of, calculate where they're supposed to be and let the river do its work. The stream could, I and my colleagues have hypothesized that maybe we could let it just self-organize, just work it out by itself and see if it can sort itself into these repetitive sequences, like they would be if we had constructed them. And we also hypothesized that if it were able to do that, if we just let the system do that, it would also develop some organization in the physical properties and ecological properties into a stable, complex morphology and landscape. So we did that. I'm going to share this, and the experiments that we ended up doing were in part supported by NSF. So this is restoration of Wildcat Creek, which is again in Berkeley, very close to the UC Berkeley campus. It had been sort of a problematic channel in that it kept incising and so on, and so in a way it had been restored once previously in the year 2000. You kind of see some of these older photos, and here's the location of Wildcat Creek, which drains into the San Francisco Bay. And again, it had been restored once in the year 2000, but it still continually kept incising and so forth. And in 2006, it was a very wet year, and that area had experienced a very large storm, and the whole thing kind of failed again. And at that time, here's some other photos. At that time, the owners of the land, which is the East Bay District, they managed the land. They were able to get a large grant from FEMA. I was actually a little bit surprised because this section of Wildcat Creek it was on a golf course, and so it didn't seem like that it would be a huge risk to people, but still FEMA supported this study. So here's the map again. And here's the reach that was restored, and I was able to participate as something of a technical advisor to the project. And we convinced the district to use this natural approach of installing the step pool sequences, but again, not anchoring them in place. And we had a pretty good idea as to where they ought to be and so forth. And so this is kind of what it looked like after we put in the step pool sequences in this restoration reach. But more fun was the fact that somehow we were able to convince them to let us have a 30-meter stretch of this channel that we would conduct experiments in. So that's what we call the experimental reach, in which I said, why don't we just put the rocks randomly in the channel, not even calculate where they're supposed to be, but just randomly, and see if the flow, the river, can indeed sort itself out. Like, I had a pretty good hunch that it would, based on what we know, as long as we got the sizes of the rocks right. I think that was kind of the key, was getting the sizes of the rocks right, in the context of the flows, right? So that's kind of what we did, and we can see this experimental reach where the rocks were just kind of strewn randomly. And here's a sketch of what it looks like with the rocks kind of strewn randomly. And at the head of the reach, just for good measure, we placed another pile of rocks here, and again to see if the stream would move it and to sort it out into this rhythmic sequence of steps. And again, here's another photo of what it looks like, no step pool sequences, right? And then so we tracked it for 3 years after that. Can you guess what I'm going to report? If it was no good, I'm not sure that I'd be here, right? Okay, so this is how cool it was. Well, first, this is what we did, the field data collection. So for 3 years after that, we tracked both the physical characteristics, survey longitudinal profiles, cross-sections, measured particle sizes, and we also did some terrestrial LiDAR scanning, which I am not showing today, but also integrating with biological assessments, mostly focusing on benthic macroinvertebrates, They are very good indicators of the quality of the stream and the quality of the water. So we also sampled benthic macroinvertebrates and then identified them in the lab and then assessed and determined many metrics to, again, indicate the quality of the stream. These are actually UC Berkeley students. I worked with a couple of aquatic ecologists at Berkeley and also at Humboldt State University. That was kind of our collaboration, and you see the survey here measuring the physical properties of the channel. So this is what happened in the next few years. Again, this was the initial channel. This is the profile showing just sort of a plain bed and the randomly strewn rocks, and this is again what it looked like. So after the first winter rains, only one season of winter rains, this is what it looked like. It was already developing steps by themselves. And here's the long profile where you see the arrows are incidences, occurrences of step pools like that. Not a whole lot, not very many, and not yet, and we have some indices and metrics to express, articulate the development, the extent of the development of the step pool profile. It wasn't quite there yet. It wasn't really a well-developed sequence or profile, but still, again, there were several here. And here's the plan sketch showing the locations of the step pool sequences. So it was kind of happening even over one storm season, one winter season. So we continued, and by the next season, whoa, it was already pretty much the characteristic pattern. You see the repetitive pattern of steps and pools and steps and pools and so forth. And the long profile where the arrows appear, again, indicates the location. And again, we have some ways of calculating these things, the steps and relative to the slope, and this number then would indicate the extent, the development. And so we would conclude, even by the second year, that it was a characteristic, well-developed step pool sequence. We didn't have to do anything. All we did was place rocks there, and the stream did the work, right? And this is the plan sketch, again, showing the steps and then the particle sizes, and we did some other analyses. In the third year, this was kind of the last year that we did, by the way, we installed this in 2012, and the last year that we monitored this was in 2015. And same thing, it was still we could call it a step pool channel by that time, and with the sort of characteristic spacing and the morphology in these things, right? So far, isn't that really cool? It's really cool, right? Yeah. Okay, so now the ecological part. The ecological part. So our hypothesis also is that, all right, so now as the step pool sequences develop, can you imagine that we're also seeing habitats forming, right? Pool habitats and step habitats and pool habitats, so it's a partitioning of the channel into habitats. And so our hypothesis was that, well, as these habitats form, we should expect the organisms to colonize, and we would expect to see distinct groupings of benthic macroinvertebrates, right? And presumably that would lead to higher diversity in a better, more complex channel and landscape. So that was kind of our hypothesis. So now the ecological parts, oops, sorry. Let me go. Oh, so yeah, so the conclusion about the morphological assessment was that, yeah, we were able to document a characteristic step pool pattern by the second storm season, basically in a year and a half. That surprised me even, that it was able to do that quickly. So the ecological part kind of mapping on top of it. Again, mostly the work of my aquatic ecology collaborators, so I won't get into the details so much, but the idea was that they sampled the habitats, the steps and pools, and identified the organisms and determined some differences or similarities between these habitats and so forth. And we could see already, potentially, for example, here, and here are some of the metrics, percent sensitive EPT. that indicates, I guess, the quality of the stream in part. And there was already some distinctions, like the steps greater than pools and so forth. And again, I won't get into the details. But my colleagues also use ordination, which is a very common technique in ecology, to also determine associations and clusters in the groupings and so forth. And by the second year, that's what these figures show, that we were able to identify clusters of organisms. The blue is the steppes, and then this orange or peach color is the pools. Basically that the organisms were getting distinguishable by the second year in the pools and in the steppes, right? So it's not just the morphology forming, but yeah, the organisms were following, basically, and sorting themselves out as well, right? And so the benthic macroinvertebrates were distinct in the habitat types by the second storm season, so also very rapidly. I think it was more how rapid these things occur that surprised me and that surprised us. Not so much that they did occur, but really how rapidly they occur, and that was really a cool thing to see. And so, as expected, as you know, these things kind of got distinguished between steppe and pool and the habitats. Again, we expected an increase in the diversity, and so there are some metrics, including the Shannon Diversity Index, and we did see some increase in diversity over time in each of the habitats and also in general. And again, I won't go into the details too much here, but yes, the diversity also increased ecologically as the steppe pool channel developed. And then again, there's some other more complex analyses of the ecologists, the ordination, that also allowed us to conclude that this experimental reach, again, that started with nothing, just a plain bed, as it developed and as the ecology and the organisms also became more distinguishable, that this reach, we also had a reference reach for comparison for the ecology, for the ecological parameters, that it also became indistinguishable from the reference reach. Basically, as it developed, ecologically, it became the same as a reference reach that was not, again, that was kind of an ideal, I suppose, right? So these are the main findings. And again, it was how quickly this happened, and we didn't do anything really, right? Yeah. So we just tracked and held our breaths as we tracked, right? So the main finding then, the main conclusion is that there was this rapid morphologic and ecological co-organization. They kind of happened together. The morphology led, and then the ecology sort of followed, and together they developed this complex and stable steppe pool channel, again from this plain bed, disorganized bunch of rocks, I guess, into this kind of organized form, and also ecologically. So kind of summarizing the steps here. Yeah, natural flows were capable of redistributing these rocks into the pattern very quickly. 1.5 years was all it took. And then secondly, as these steps formed, the benthic macroinvertebrates were distinct in the habitat types by also the second year. It was also that quickly. And that the distinguishable assemblages increased the diversity of the channel through the study period. And finally, by the third year, that reach that we were studying, the experimental reach, was not distinguishable from a reference reach ecologically. So we might say again that it has sort of developed this complex, stable morphology, and also along with the ecological parts to it. So in the end, in terms of our initial goal of exploring these natural approaches, so we were very encouraged, obviously, about these natural approaches to restore channels, and it gives promise for others and future restoration projects to potentially not engineer so much, to the extent, of course, that I guess one is willing to accept some risk. We were able to do this because it was in a golf course, and so in a way it was lucky, and that's what gave us the opportunity to do these experiments, right? So, okay, so I hope you enjoyed that. It was just really cool, and that paper that I showed, it appeared just a few days ago. It was just a few days ago, so I'm just especially excited about it. River Research and Applications is the journal, right?
How do we, I mean, I realize some engineers are gonna lose their jobs.
Yeah.
But this is huge, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
how does that get into the FEMA restoration and what are the next steps for that?
So we had a feeling that one of the reviewers of our paper was an engineer because at first it gave us a really hard time. Yeah. Yes, of course. Yeah. But it has to be kind of, yeah, but still.
I mean, that's incredible, right?
It is
Like, that's-
incredible. Yeah.
I'm just
But
blown away.
potentially that cannot happen probably, you know, in the middle of a dense urban area probably because of all kinds of things, regulatory, insurance, and political, economic, and so forth. I guess what we demonstrated is that it's possible. I think that's what we can say, that is possible. But then, you know, that's not the, there are just many other factors, yeah. But we had an engineer working with us. Yeah, that actually he was the main consultant who, I knew him a little bit, but he was the one who contacted me to work together. So, you know, I think that there are many engineers who are at this stage to want to seek and develop some more environmental approaches to doing this. Right? Just like our colleagues in civil engineering, they have the sustainability program now, and I have one student from their program in my fluvial geomorphology class, so I think, yeah, you know, there's a merging of goals and interests in here. Peter?
Well, this question may reveal my ignorance of geomorphology, but is there anything interesting going on in the nearby urban creek step pools and ecosystems?
That is a very engineered stream. Yeah, the banks, it's not really one that can adjust so much. Isn't it a channelized bank, I believe? Yeah, to a large extent. So I think it was part of that big, huge project, right, Cherry Creek?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it isn't a good example probably because of the fact that it is already so.
That must be pretty common in urban areas.
Yeah, for sure, yeah.
So, in a natural unmanaged stream, do the step pools ever get reset after like a
It
flood or
does,
something?
yeah, it does. Large floods, wildfires, and that's what we documented as well, because after wildfires and large floods, yeah, the whole thing can go. But then it takes time, and and many studies have documented how it reforms, how it can reform. It can take time, and that is why I was a little bit surprised at how quickly that's happening. Yeah. Happy? And then maybe we go get a drink. Yeah.
Yeah. So I had a question about how much do you think the seasonal hydrograph of this area drives? With like the difference between all the rain in primarily in the winter as opposed to maybe how precipitation falls in Colorado or another region that would affect it?
Yeah, so this is winter, I guess winter storms, frontal storms. And so we try to make the measurements after each season, but I don't think seasonality would affect the process, but maybe the timing probably. The seasonality is trickier for the benthic macroinvertebrates, and that was one of our challenges because I think there was one time step when we did not get it exactly. I think it was one December and one March, and so that sort of confounded the interpretation is more for the Benthic River. Yeah, so, yeah, not perfect. There's some things that are not perfect, but yeah, good enough. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Maybe last. Yeah, unless there was
I think like Amanda said, I think this is huge with all these flash floods that are happening all over the place and washing buildings and so on and so forth. So in deciding what type of material to put on the stream and how big or how small and which ones will contribute to be like, bullets in the water instead of stopping the water, how does that work?
Yeah, that is the hardest part. I mean, you can imagine if it's too small, if the particles are too small, it'll wash, right? And then if it's too big, they won't move. They won't sort themselves. So that is the trickiest part. That was actually largely the job of the hydraulic engineer we worked with. We would calculate forces and sizes, and also, we would have an idea given the slope, and also maybe the area and so forth, but kind of calculating the sizes and the flows that would be expected. Those are the two things, because it's kind of the water, the force, and then the sizes of the rocks, and kind of getting that right. But that is the hardest part, is getting it right. So I guess we kind of got it right, because they didn't completely wash away and they sorted. Right? Yeah. But that is the hard, and that's why those large floods and post-fire, there's too much water, then it would completely wash away until it kind of gets itself back sorted. Right? Yeah, that's the cool thing about these rivers, about river systems, aren't they? I mean, kind of cool. Yeah, and so so the idea, let the river do its work, and so if we understand, that's kind of our job, right, to understand it, and then kind of to guide that work out there, right? And so that's been really fun and again important for me. Right? And kind of like citizen science, same thing, really, getting our work out there and participating out there. Right? Was there anything?
Yeah, well, it's kind of similar to my question about this in dry climates, for example. This seems like a very climate specific kind of practice to use for just stream morphology. So
I don't think so. That's a good question, and maybe we need to think about it a little bit more. Yeah, I don't know offhand. I don't think so, but the climate would influence the flow and the frequency of the flow, and so maybe it would not, I don't know, like if it were in Israel, hyper-arid, there's the cool systems there, but because if it rains and floods so infrequently, maybe we would have to wait years for that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think I would want to think about that. It's a good question, really good question.
Thanks.
Yeah.